Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, talking Ohio State Buckeyes as the Buckeyes prepare for another Big Ten game with Minnesota in town. PJ Fleck and company. We bring in Steve Hellwagon. He is the Big Ten senior writer for 247 Sports as well as Bucknuts. Steve, how you doing today?
Doing great. What's going on, Mark?
Not too much. Just want to remind everyone to like, comment, and subscribe as we bring you the best in discussion, debate, and analysis on college football. I think I'm going to first we'll clean up the administration port of this as we had discussed right before we started to record. If you can get us square on some injury concerns, Malik Harrison, Jonathan Cooper as well.
Yeah, two of Ohio State's defensive starters may or may not play. It's kind of up in the air. Jonathan Cooper and Malik Harrison, both of them left last week's game against Indiana, apparently with concussion concerns. So I guess we won't know maybe till closer to game time on Saturday at noon Eastern time when they host Minnesota, what their availability would be. It would seem that Tyreek Smith, a freshman, or Jayshon Cornell could play in place of Jonathan Cooper. Malik Harrison, it's hard to say who could fill in for him at outside linebacker. Perhaps Keandre Jones or perhaps Baron Browning might play there. Hard to say. But one way or the other, I'm not sure that their availability and their status for this game is going to really impact the bottom line. Ohio State, a 4-touchdown favorite to beat Minnesota. Kind of a funny anecdote that goes with that. Urban Meyer earlier this week was not asked a whole lot about Minnesota, but kind of volunteered that they have a, quote, top 20 defense. And if you'll note, if you look at the team defense, total defense standings, Minnesota is indeed 21st nationally in yards allowed per game. Let's see what it says right here. 324.2 yards per game. Now, I think you need to put an asterisk by that because Minnesota played its first 3 games of the season against New Mexico State, Fresno State, and Miami of Ohio. They won all 3 of those games handily. Mark, guess what happened when they got into Big Ten play? They gave up 42 points to Maryland and 48 points to Iowa last week. So, while in the yards allowed category, they are on paper 21st, I can tell you in Big Ten play, and I don't have any of those stats in front of me, they're probably 12th, 13th, or 14th in terms of points allowed in Big Ten conference games so far this season. 42 to Maryland, 48 to Iowa, and my guess is Ohio State will be pushing with its offense, pushing that 50 mark tomorrow.
Yeah, I was never a big proponent of the yards allowed or the yards gained, just that as a straight metric. I know that's the traditional way to rank the offenses and defenses, but then especially when you're talking about a pass offense or a pass defense, when you talk about teams that are really bad that throw the ball 50 times because they're always behind, or a really good team that passes efficiently, but they don't have to pass much because they're always ahead. And as you mentioned with Minnesota, they played no Power Fives outside of conference. I don't know when the Jim Delaney Big Ten rule is going to kick in here. Probably in the next couple seasons because they have to play a Power 5 at some point. But Minnesota typically takes it light in the non-conference scheduling.
You know, to their credit, they did have a series with USC. I think they had one with Oregon State.
TCU.
At TCU here in recent years. Yes. So they have been playing one a year, but Minnesota was really in recent years has been almost an annual bowl caliber type team. But, I think they're going back to the old Glenn Mason model, which is play 3 easy wins and hope. Above hope, you can go 3-6 in the Big Ten, get to your 6 wins and get to a bowl game. I think at least until PJ Fleck has had the opportunity to get a few recruiting classes in there. Fleck, his team at Western Michigan played Wisconsin in the bowl game, and I know they kept it closer than Fleck's Minnesota team did last year. They lost 31-0. I know that Western Michigan the year before against Wisconsin in the Cotton Bowl gave them a pretty good game. I think it was a 14 or 17-point final. So he's got a lot of work on his hands. Doesn't help that when he got got there. The quarterback position was kind of bare, and he's playing a walk-on true freshman. Zach Annexstad will make the start, it appears, for Minnesota this week, although he was even banged up a little bit last week in the Iowa game, but looks like he's had a recurring ankle injury that's kind of bothered him all season, but he'll be getting the chance, it appears. He played on the same high school team at IMG as Artur Satowski, the quarterback at Rutgers, and it looks like Annexstad got most of the work as the starter. Sitkowski also played some, was primarily the backup there. And we know how that went for Rutgers. Sitkowski started for Rutgers here at Ohio State in week 2, and Ohio State won that game 52-3. I don't know if it'll be quite that lopsided this time around, because Minnesota looks like they're capable of putting at least a few points on the board, but I can't imagine that we're going to be sitting here in the fourth quarter tomorrow and Zach Annexstad is leading Minnesota to some kind of an important drive. I just don't see that as a possibility.
The interesting footnote about Zach Annexstad is that he became just the second true freshman walk-on to start for a Power 5 school in history. Apparently, this has been verified a number of times.
I think it was in the season opener, yes.
Baker Mayfield being the other one for Texas Tech.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? But again, at a Power 5 school, it's hard to imagine that a freshman would get to play, let alone a guy who was a walk-on. Now, he was a preferred walk-on, and I got to believe that he'll be placed on scholarship. Maybe they're at their 85-man limit right now. I don't know, but got to believe that when the winter term comes and they flip over the calendar year and some of those outgoing seniors who graduated come off the rolls, that he'll be one of the first guys placed on scholarship for next calendar year. But he's done a bang-up job. I mean, they're 3-2, as we said, won the 3 games they should have won. Amazingly, I figured they would give Maryland a much better game than that, and just got annihilated. Of course, that was a week after Maryland had played Temple and had its world kind of rocked to the core with that game, where they didn't even really factor in that game. So we're seeing a lot of that type of thing this year, Mark, where a team will go out and lose a game that maybe you think, well, maybe they shouldn't have lost that game, and they just come back with a vengeance the following week and have taken care of business. So I think these bounce back games are something always in college football. Just the nature of when your roster is 18 to 22-year-old kids, they ride the highs and they fall for the lows, and it's just kind of a tough thing sometimes. But I do give Minnesota some credit. I mean, 3-2, but again, I think for them to get to a bowl game, they're going to have to eke out 3 more wins here in Big Ten play. And, obviously they'll play Illinois at some point. Perhaps that's one. And I'm not sure where else they're going to be able to steal a game down the stretch.
As Lou Holtz once famously said, and I'm sure you remember, you never know which team's going to show up week to week. It's not the same team. I think there's a semblance of teams in college football that we can count on. Ohio State's near the top, along with Alabama, Clemson, some other teams that typically show up, and we know what they are. They're so talented, but there's just a glut of teams. We never know who's going to show up. And the thing that makes the Maryland result alarming is, as you mentioned, here is a top 20 defense. Then they take on Maryland. They give up 42. They're never really in the game in the second half. Maryland turns around. They play a Michigan team where it looks better on the scoreboard, 42-21, but one of them was a special teams kickoff return for a touchdown for the Terps. The other one was a late game, meaningless in the last couple minutes touchdown. So Maryland basically put together one scoring drive against Michigan. Now, the Gophers did come back this week, and even though they lost by 17 and Iowa was pretty comfortable in the fourth quarter, at one point I caught much of the game on the Big Ten Network, the replay, and they had a strip sack of Nate Stanley and made it 31-24 in the second half, so they were within firing range, but not nearly good enough to beat Iowa. The one thing I will ask you, Steve, is based on this Minnesota defensive performance breaking down the last couple weeks, they're facing an Ohio State run game that I was a bit surprised just wasn't really churning out the yardage against Indiana last week.
Yeah, Ohio State's kind of struggled establishing the run here of late. I think they netted under 4 yards a carry last week against Indiana. It's J.K. Dobbins and Mike Weber are the two guys that are kind of leading the way there. Dobbins, his numbers were something like 26 carries for 75 yards, somewhere along those lines. I think part of what Ohio State is running into is the efficiency of Dwayne Haskins as a passer, with the idea that he has not been throwing the ball down the field all that much. Throws a lot of flanker screens. They throw a lot of times the short pass to the motion man where they just flip it to him as he goes by. And I think the defenses are finding that these plays are better defensed by having more guys actually at the line of scrimmage, believe it or not. I believe he's also scoring well on some crossing patterns, but they're not very deep, typically between 5 and 10 yards off the line of scrimmage. So until he starts throwing the ball up the field a little more regularly, which he did at times, he threw the deep pass to Johnny Dixon in that game last week for a touchdown. But he has not been throwing a lot of passes beyond 5 or 10 yards downfield. So the defenses are countering by playing 7 or 8 guys within the first 5 or 10 yards of the line of scrimmage and in the box, so to speak. And that's helped them, I think, in some regards, bottle up the run. So I think the Buckeyes need to get back to being able to running the football, establishing the run when they want to run it, get the 4, 5, 10 yards of carry that they've been accustomed to. And yet, when you have a talent like Haskins at your disposal, you get your 600 yards offense, you get your 50 points. It's just only 120 or 150 yards are now coming from running the football. I'm not sure how sustainable that is going down the stretch in the Big Ten when the weather gets bad and you're going to need to be able to run the football again. But Ohio State's offensive line is very capable. It could just be a numbers thing, as I've kind of laid out there. And one of the things I noticed last week, Mark, I mean, it was a hot day at Ohio Stadium, early October. It was still close to 90 degrees and probably down the field closer to 100 in terms of what it felt like. And what I noticed was Ohio State would get 6 or 8 plays into a drive and then try and sneak a wide receiver or a running back onto the field. And when you do that, the center judge comes over and stands over the ball and doesn't let you run the play until the opponent has had a reasonable amount of time to substitute. And what Indiana was doing, it looked like a line change in hockey where you dump the puck in behind the net and they would run 6 guys in. Ohio State may have only been subbing 1 player, but because the opponent gets the opportunity to substitute as well, Indiana was prepared after about the first or second drive and said, hey, if we ever see them blank on that other sideline, send 5 guys because we can get fresh bodies up front. I think that played a big role in stacking up the Ohio State running game because you had Ohio State's offensive linemen who were on the field for 94 plays on a 90-degree day, and they're trying to block guys who, in some cases, were fresh coming off the bench in the middle of a drive. So I think to my way of thinking, I think that has to be a factor in what Ohio State does this week. Maybe if they get into those type of drives, maybe they slow down their tempo, but they keep the same receivers and running backs on the field so the other team can't get that advantage and sub against them. So it's kind of the old cat and mouse game. But that was something I definitely noticed is Indiana, when they were given the opportunity to bring fresh players off the bench, they were bringing them in 5 and 6 at a time. They were placing probably 5 of their front 7 in a given substitution, which you don't see that very often unless you're going to maybe a 3rd and long where you have your package. But even then, it's usually just a couple guys for a couple guys to swap out a pass rusher or a nickelback type situation. So to me, that was kind of the game inside the game last week.
We're on the line with Steve Hellwagon of Bucknuts. He's also a Big Ten senior writer for 247 Sports. Joins us on a regular basis to set us up on the Buckeyes with Minnesota in town. The Gophers are 3-2, and as Steve mentions, it's a narrow path to postseason play for PJ Fleck rowing the boat. But there are games coming up for the Gophers against the likes of Illinois and Nebraska in particular to try to get there, but he's probably going to have to steal a win against somebody good. They are a 29-point underdog against the Buckeyes this week. We talk about Dwayne Haskins, and you get 1,000 times more Ohio State feedback than I do. But what I hear from Buckeyes fans is that they're so happy Dwayne Haskins is the quarterback in comparison to JT Barrett. But I think you touched upon something a few minutes ago regarding the running game that is very important as the weather becomes more inclement, that we may come to appreciate JT Barrett's effectiveness in the running game more and more because that's just not there with Dwayne Haskins.
No, he kept it 7 times last week and hardly got any yards at all, maybe 25 yards. I don't know, not much. But, there were times, when Barrett, he would have a 100-yard game rushing. I mean, he was very devastating running the football. I think it is obviously a trade-off when you're talking about what Haskins has been able to do throwing the ball and the emergence, to me, of this wide receiver group as well, talking about Terry McLaurin, Paris Campbell. In his last 3 games, Paris Campbell, the statistics are almost amazing. I'm looking to see if I've got it here. 24 catches for 349 yards and 4 touchdowns. That's what Paris Campbell has done in the last 3 games. And he's really coming into his own. I mean, we knew he was talented. We knew he was fast. They brought him in motion last week against Indiana from left to right. And then he just kind of leaked out into the right flat. And there was obviously a coverage break because Indiana didn't send anybody with him. And Dwayne got the ball out to him pretty quick in the right flat. And when nobody came, Paris was gone down the right sideline for the touchdown. So this has kind of been a hand-in-hand type thing. Haskins has been amazing, but so have McLaurin and Campbell. And KJ Hill and Austin Mack and even Ben Victor has really come on, and Johnny Dixon. The one thing we haven't seen anything of is the tight end. The OSU's tight ends in 6 games have a combined 5 catches, which is pretty amazing. Luke Farrell's been kind of the starter there. Rashad Berry has been involved, and the true freshman, Jeremy Ruckert. Those 3 have been kind of the leaders at that position. But the passes have been few and far between to them. Berry, of course, had a ball go off his hands that was intercepted the previous game against Penn State. So we'll see maybe if, as this season goes on, if Kevin Wilson, who doubles as the tight ends coach, could find a way to get his guys more involved. But what Haskins, has done has been nothing short of remarkable. He leads the country with 25 touchdown passes right now and has been nothing short of phenomenal so far for Ohio State.
Get Steve Hellwagon on the line from Bucknuts. Please join him there for the very best in Ohio State football coverage. Steve, on the live chat here, you're being patted on the back for your questioning of Jim Delaney at the Big Ten Media Days. Some people thought that you had asked some very insightful questions.
Oh, well, thank you. Was there yesterday. The Big Ten Basketball Media Day was in Chicago. It's kind of a neat event because from anywhere in the Big Ten footprint, you can catch a flight and be at O'Hare by 7:30 in the morning, and they started at 8 a.m. Commissioner Delaney obviously is at the forefront of college athletics, and I just think that again he has got his finger on the pulse of all these things. The Big Ten's going to 20 basketball games this coming year. And certainly, what you're seeing, the product on the field with what the Big Ten was able to do last year in the bowls has been outstanding. And Michigan obviously played for the national championship in basketball. And there are Big Ten schools across the board, and a lot of these other Olympic sports. So, yeah, I feel like yesterday was a great opportunity to get these newsmakers like a Tom Izzo out there and get their stance on some of the top issues of the day. And, for Delaney, he did address the ongoing trial in New York regarding the basketball situation with Adidas. And it is kind of a troubling situation. But, yeah, I think I'm sure that there was plenty to talk about after yesterday, no doubt.
All right, Steve Hellwagon joins us on a regular basis to talk Ohio State football. The Buckeyes taking on 3-2 Minnesota. We've got several folks in the live chat, as I think any Ohio State fan would be. Going back to, I think the classic example was the Baker Mayfield, Oklahoma win, 31-16, exposing linebackers in coverage in the secondary to a large extent. The Indiana game earlier that year as well, especially the one-on-one on the outside. And maybe this continuing to be a trouble spot for the Buckeyes as the Hoosiers hung in the game. It was 35-26 at one point in the second half.
Yeah, Ohio State showed some real stubbornness here with how they play defensively. Gave up two 90-yard plays already this season against TCU and Penn State. Last week, Indiana, Peyton Ramsey threw for over 300 yards for Indiana. And as I met with some of our Indiana people in Chicago yesterday, Indiana's actually got a guy who's an even better thrower, I suppose, than Peyton Ramsey. So that's not getting to play a whole lot this year. So just imagine if Indiana had a guy who could throw the ball, he probably would have thrown for about 400 yards. But at any rate, the kind of my running, I wouldn't call it a joke because I don't feel that this is really that funny, but Alabama's offense would probably put a big number up on Ohio State if they played this week. And I guess that's the one silver lining out of this is that they're not going to play this week. So Ohio State's got to take full advantage of each of these last 6 regular season games to make the improvements necessary on the defensive side of the ball, because what they're doing the week before against Penn State, Trace McSorley exploited the linebackers, had over 450 yards total offense. And then last week, Peyton Ramsey and his wide receiver group is, it's a nice group of guys. And, we can count the Ohio State defensive backs, one by one at various points in the game. All the starters and some of the backups, they all gave up a big play. And at some point in the game, most of that same group of 5 or 6 DBs was also flagged for either holding or pass interference. So they're really struggling at times right now with the man-to-man coverage aspect. Some of it has to do with the fact that Nick Bosa is not there to rush the passer. And so some of those pass rushes aren't getting home, and the opposing quarterback is having time to get the ball out to the receivers and to make some plays. So perhaps, again, and you missed Jonathan Cooper, perhaps this week, does that take it down a notch? You have Chase Young, but my guess is he's going to be doubled and tripled this week if Cooper's not playing, or if they don't have a viable threat coming up the middle as well. So they've got some issues on the defensive side of the football. I don't know that Minnesota is going to test them. It says here, as great as that Minnesota defense is, 21st in the country, which we joked about earlier, these are numbers that you can put full stock in. Minnesota is 100th in passing and 114th in total offense, 341 yards a game. So Zach Annexstad and the boys, they've had their top 2 running backs are out. One of them could come back. The other one is out for the year. So, they're relying on, second, third string running backs and a freshman quarterback to try and win games on the road in the Big Ten. Even if it's not Ohio State and 105,000 people, it's still a very difficult thing to expect a freshman quarterback to be able to do that.
Iowa, by far the best defense Minnesota's seen. So basically the same 3 out of 5 opponents that Minnesota bulked up the defensive stats on, they weren't able to bulk up the offensive stats on the likes of New Mexico and Fresno State and Miami of Ohio.
Yeah.
So that's a bit troubling.
Yeah, no question about it. And, as I said, Fleck, His track record's pretty good. He put together a winner at Western Michigan in 4 years there, and I think recruiting is going to be key to it. Minnesota is producing more and more prospects and top prospects every year, but he's got to get more than his share from the upper Midwest. That means out recruiting Wisconsin and Illinois and Iowa in particular, and getting in Nebraska and getting the top players from the upper Midwest to choose Minnesota, get kids from outside the footprint from the Sun Belt states who can be difference makers to come up and play at Minnesota, which is kind of a challenge. Basically from this point until about April, it's real cold and a lot of snow usually up there in Minneapolis. But I think that if anybody can do it, Fleck can do it. He's got more energy than 5 people. So he's certainly got more than I do. I tell you, getting up for that flight yesterday morning has got me still a little off kilter. But I'm looking forward to the game tomorrow. I just think that, again, Ohio State's not a finished product, and they're not. I mean, they may be number 3 in ranking, but, there are a lot of teams out there that have lined up with this team and can at least contain the Ohio State defense, can give them a heck of a game.
And to Fleck's credit, you mentioned the days at Western Michigan in which he was able to take a team that he won 1 game with the first season and build it up to a team that had recruited the best in the MAC 3 consecutive years. And if I remember correctly, I typically remember scores 24-16 within Wisconsin, in a Wisconsin team that made it to the Big Ten championship game in the Cotton Bowl. So he did a reclamation project of remarkable proportions there. He tries to do the same with Minnesota, but of course the Gophers were an 8 and 9 win football team before he got there, but the cupboard was fairly bare once he did get there. We got Steve Hellwagon on the line from Bucknuts. Steve, we will let you go. I just have one other question here in the live chat and want to let everyone out there know that as soon as we're done with Steve, we're going to shut down. And we've got Cam Underwood from State of the U to talk Miami football coming up in just a minute. So look out for that link coming your way and just keep it right on MarkRogersTV.com and you'll see it pop up right there. We've got somebody asking on the line about Brandon Bowen, who of course had surgery and was out the early part of September, of if we have any idea when he's coming back.
Yeah, Coach Meyer was asked about him on Monday. Bowen is a guy who won a guard spot last year, but broke his leg at midseason, was lost for the duration of the year, and tried to come back for preseason camp this year and needed basically had to have another surgical procedure. It sounds like it was a minor surgical procedure, perhaps to clean some things up, and he was operating in tremendous pain as we understand it. So I think the hope is that he would get healthy, and perhaps after their open week, they play Purdue next week. Then they have an open week. Then they're back home with Nebraska, and then really the rubber hits the road at Michigan State, at Maryland, and back home with Michigan to close out the regular season at least. The hope may be that Bowen could be back sometime in November, perhaps. And you look at the 2 guard spots, Knox and Pridgeon. Pridgeon's done a bang-up job. Knox routinely has at least 1 penalty a game, either a false start or a holding penalty. But, how do you really quibble? I mean, Ohio State's averaging 565 yards total offense, but maybe he's a guy that can provide at least some depth and support and, maybe supplant one of those guys. But it's hard to say whether they would make that move. He'd have to win the job basically in practice. So I guess we'll have to see if Bowen's a guy that they're going to go to down the stretch if and when he's back.
Ohio State football fans, keep in mind that we're here all the time talking Ohio State, the Big Ten, and the rest of the nation. So please like, comment, and subscribe. That helps keep the engine running here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. And check out Steve's work at Bucknuts, where he is a senior Big Ten writer for 247 Sports. Steve, we appreciate you stopping by. As always, enjoy the game.
Okay, Mark, take care.